As we continue with our study of the gospel, or the book of Genesis, we go through chapters 11, 12, and 13, and we're really at a major turning point within the entire story of the Old Testament. One of the most important events, of course, in the scriptures is the creation and fall. But after that, probably for the Old Testament, the most important event is the event that sees Abraham chosen to be the one through whom God will bring a blessing to all nations. It's very interesting with the way this is divided for our study that we first of all consider chapter 11, because it really is the prelude to why Abraham is chosen. We've seen that God creates and that Adam and Eve sin and turn away from God. We see that they are cast out of the garden, but God is gracious enough not to put them to death right away. We see that Cain kills Abel, but in spite of his murderous activity, a mark is put on his head and he's not killed. The world is wicked and almost everyone is destroyed except for Noah and his family, but a few are spared. And so this pattern that has been pointed out has been repeated several times of sin, the consequences, and yet some grace. The last event, the building of the Tower of Babel, is not treated in quite the same way. We see that the people try to make a name for themselves, and as a result of what they have done, God says, I'm going to scatter people, I'm going to confuse their languages so they will not all be able to work together. And there's no seeming way out. There's no grace at the end of the story, because really all of 1 to 11 is a sort of a setup for explaining really why God chose the people of Abraham. As we look more intently at the story of the Tower of Babel, a lot of people will talk about the word Babel in terms of Babel or a confusion of tongues. The actual Hebrew, or the actual Akkadian or Babylonian word, Bab-Elu, actually refers to the gateway to the gods, and gets at this idea that this ziggurat, or this big tower that the people were building, was to replicate a way in which they could come up to God, where they would rise up high to be able to see God. Somebody once said that the only man-made thing that anyone can see from space, except of course for lights of cities at night, the only other thing that can be seen is the Great Wall of China. Now that may be changed today, but from not too much of a distance, it does not look like we have changed much on this earth, and yet we pride ourselves in how much we do and how hard we work and all of the efforts that we make, and yet we really don't change the landscape much. These people here at Babel, or what later would be known as Babylon, think that they can come together and that they can do anything they put their mind to. It's probably one of the biggest frustrations in life that there are always those thorns with the roses. There's always something that doesn't work, no matter how hard we work at what we do. And even if we have put great effort into something, there's always something that doesn't seem to fit. God says that that's part of the fall into sin. Romans 1 tells us that God has committed this creation to frustration, that things are not always going to work right by design. He says, I will not let you think that this is a perfect world, because it isn't. If anything really works well, then you will lose your awareness of the fact that this is not the world I created. And therefore, God says the consequences of human sin are going to have an effect all over the place. These people decide that they're going to build a tower. In the flat plain, the flood plain in southern Iraq, if you wanted to get up to the gods, and people used to think that the gods dwelt in mountains, then you were in trouble because there are no mountains down there. So the idea was that people would build a tower which would sort of help them replicate a mountain, so they could get higher to be up closer to the gateway to the gods. And people in that day thought of many, many different deities, each having various power over parts of the world. Well, God says, I'll make sure that they can't even pull this off. I'll confuse their languages. What we have then in the rest of chapter 11, after this confusion of languages, is the story about how various tribes and peoples would have gone in different directions, but we focus in a little bit more on the people of Shem, the descendants of Shem, particularly Eber, E-B-E-R, whose name is often connected with the Hebrew people, even though there's a little bit of a difference in the way that is spelled for us today with an H instead of with an E as it begins. That's a change that came later. And what it really does in the rest of chapter 11 is it provides a rather quick link for us to Abraham's family. There's a section in the book of Joshua at the very end in chapter 24 that's very helpful here for us. Many people think that God chose Abram, or Abraham as he's later called, because he was a good person, a righteous person, a believer, someone who qualified for God's love. If we remember that every human being is born sinful, then we realize that no one qualifies for God's love, nor does Abraham. When God chooses him, Joshua 24 says he, his father Terah, and the rest of the family served other gods. God's grace always comes first. God says, I will reach out and I will love you. The response to God's love is what we call faith. Martin Luther sensed this in the third article of the Creed when he says, I believe that I cannot by my own reason or strength believe in Jesus Christ my Lord or come to him. Abraham couldn't either. He could not find God. People want the kind of peace and settledness, the access to God, but no matter what kind of tower they build, they'll never get there. So people in the ancient world, look to deities that could offer them power. Today we might look to such things as a bull market in the stocks, or a good bill of health from the doctor, or whatever it might be, that we grab something of a kind of a security that we want. Abram is being pulled away from his entire family now. In the beginning part of Genesis 12, God says to him, I'll make of you a great nation, and you'll be a blessing to all other nations on the earth. Those who bless you I will bless, those who curse you I will curse, and through you a blessing will come to all the nations. Well, the entire Old Testament is one description in a sort of a worldly sense about what that meant, but the entire New Testament is a commentary on chapter 12, verse 3. It says, the real blessing was not going to come through people who would become part of that family of Abraham and simply stay with them, but people who would, through a descendant of Abraham, receive eternal life and come to life with God forever. Now, we can't know that all of that is being said so clearly in the text that everyone would have understood it. Abram, in his own mind, may understand more, but the story that we have has a focus on Abram going to live in a foreign country. The land of Canaan, the word Canaanites is often explained as meaning the land of merchants, because the land of Israel is sort of like the interstate that goes between Iraq and Egypt. If any of you have traveled that route around Chicago, and you know everyone has to take 94 and 294 and all of that, and everything kind of narrows down, that's kind of what Canaan was like. And there are a couple of trade routes. People had to go north through Iraq and through Syria, and then down through the land of Phoenicia, what we know as Lebanon. And then they would go down by a couple of different routes all the way down to Egypt, and so you have great river valley cultures that are mixed. God says, I'm going to put you in the middle of all of that. Now we're maybe, as I have said, a couple thousand years before Christ, and the dating of this is a little bit difficult to determine sometimes because of lack of other historical events and some of the problems with the numbers and whether they've been copied correctly for us. But what happens is Abram goes into a society in what's called the Middle Bronze Age, where there were people already living there. This is not a brand new, empty world that he's going into. We have just gone fast forward through a good bit of time. The Canaanites who are in the land, you might remember, are the descendants of Ham. They are cursed according to the story in Genesis about Canaan having uncovered his grandfather's nakedness. So there is a sort of an expectation that these Canaanites, at least from the Hebrew perspective, would be justifiably removed from the country when that would happen. Now, that's not going to take place for a long time yet, but the very land that God promises to Abraham is the exact territory that 1,000 years later David will control. Everything in the rest of the Old Testament, from this point all the way through, all the way into the time of Christ, says this is a specially chosen people. The real issue now for Abram is what he's going to do about it. And verse 4 of chapter 12 says, "And Abram went." That's the real important event. Abram went. That's the faith response to God's grace. God says, I'm going to pull you away from all of the security that you know. Nobody ever moved away from their family. Nobody ever went off to make their own mark in the world. They stayed as close as they could to the people whom they trusted, because there was security only in your family. You didn't have security in big houses or big fences around someone's house. The closest you'd get to that would be to go inside some of the cities that had been built with big city walls around them, but those were built primarily just to store the grain and to have access to water. They were not where most of the people lived. So most people lived out in the open land, either in the Canaanite region having sheep and goats, or else raising crops, as some of them did, but more to be shepherds at this time. And we know that Abram has problems because his shepherds and Lot's shepherds can't get along together. But as Abram goes into the land, he first goes to some of the places that may in fact have been the sanctuaries, the religious sites of that time, sort of just kind of nodding as he goes through and saying, this will someday be in the hands of my family. But he's what we might call someone with a green card. He doesn't belong there. There is no protection for him except the promise of God. And that's what's really highlighted, that God says, I will be with you. Now, when a famine comes into the land and Abram goes down to Egypt, what he thinks is that the protection that God would have given him in the land of Canaan may not be there for him in Egypt. So he, as typically every human does, says, now I have to take matters in my own hands. And he'll do that several times during the story. But as he goes down to Egypt, he says to Sarai, as she's called there, tell them that you are my sister. Now, remember that Abram is 75 years old when he goes to the land. Sarah is 65 years old at that time. And if we would assume normal kind of practices, they would have been married for 50 years already and yet have no children. So he moves, but the real blessing of having a child is one that is still unfulfilled, and the tension in the entire story is, will God be able to give him a child through Sarah, and what will happen to that child? As it starts out, Abram falls back to his old way of thinking, and he says, tell them you're my sister. It may be, some have suggested, and it's a very hard thing, we don't have much evidence for explaining why it'd be more important that she was sister rather than wife, and we can come up with a lot of conclusions and a lot of guesses, but hard evidence is really very difficult to come by. But somehow or other it may be that Sarah is being put in an exposed position, as if she would be claimed and her wealth could be claimed by Pharaoh. One scholar has even suggested maybe what Abram is doing is saying, well, maybe because of her richness and her wealth that I have, maybe the Pharaoh will take her into his harem to get some of my wealth, but then maybe I'll get some money from the Pharaoh as well and be able to find a different wife. Now, none of that's in the Bible, but we're very puzzled about what this trading or telling that your wife is your sister is really all about. Obviously, Abram has gone down into Egypt many hundreds of years before his relatives. He's been thrown out. Later, his relatives will be kept there when they want to leave, and then God will have to deliver them. But at this time, he is thrown out of the country. One would assume that when he was up in northern Syria, that he had received or gotten Eliezer of Damascus, who will be one servant of his. Remember that he came from southern Iraq originally. Ur of the Chaldees is way down very close to the Kuwaiti border, and they would have gotten Hagar, the maid who later is impregnated by Abraham while they were down in Egypt. So he comes back to the land, and we already get the idea that God is blessing him because he and Lot have so many flocks that their shepherds are fighting together. And so Abram says to Lot, you pick whatever land you want. Well, there's a kind of a central hill country, a spine of land along the central region of the country between the Mediterranean on one side and that deep earthquake fault that formed the Jordan on the other. And the land down around the Jordan is very pretty. It seems to have been even nicer then than it is now. And so Lot decided that he wanted to go where the best land was. God takes Abram to a high point in the land and says, look all around, everywhere you can see, that land is going to go to you and your descendants forever. So there's a tension that's developing here now, a tension where God says, trust me. Abram says, okay, and he goes. But then, because there's no children, and because there is pressure both from his own family and from the outside with a drought, he begins to start acting on his own. And I hope this doesn't spoil the story for you too much, but we often talk about biblical heroes, and in some sense we need to see that all the heroes have feet of clay. Every one of them have things that they do where they turn away from God, and God has to continue to act with them by grace. That ought to be a comfort to us, not a justification for sinning, but a comfort that in times when we have turned away from God and think that we're on our own, that we can remember that He is holding on to us as well. And one of the joys of worship is a time when we can come and evaluate the days of our lives when we have looked at ourselves as if we were in Egypt, relying on ourselves, but then as we come into God's presence, to be reminded once again that He is with us. So through various events like the promise that's made to Abraham here that he'll have all of that land, God comes to him from time to time and says, I'm with you, settle down, take it a day at a time, and care for your family, and don't pull any of these kind of stunts that Abraham pulled. You don't have to protect yourself. The key point is that God is a God of people, not a God of place. He's not locked in a church building. He's not locked in a few people. He is wherever His believers and those whom He has chosen are to be found. So as we look at this section, we can remember that God's promises are going to be ongoing, even though the people might think that they have to help themselves out or help God because it doesn't look like He has delivered on the promise. Obviously, it'll be 25 years before Abraham and Sarah actually have a child, and that's a long time for anybody to wait when they think that something is going to happen very soon. May God continue to bless you in your study, and as you reflect on these human beings through whom God worked in the past, remember that He will also work through all of us, and He will help us to encourage others whose lives have been lived in Ur of the Chaldees and trying to make a name for ourselves, to remember that He is also with all of us and continues to settle us down to help us live, even in a broken and fallen world, in His presence. God's continued blessings to all of you. Thank you.